So the core argument is of the book is that I think the issue of American decline is a bit of a distraction from the real changes that are happening in the world. This book is certainly not about the U.S. decline. It doesn't assume the U.S. is declining. It does deal with that because it's part of the debate and discourse. You cannot avoid it or you cannot ignore it. But it's also not the major point of the book or even a minor point of the book. The book really talks about the order that U.S. Built, perhaps not only by itself, but in cooperation with others. And I'm also looking specifically at a very stylized representation of that order, which John Eikenberry calls the American-led liberal hegemonic order. And each of these words have meanings, which I discuss in my book. And of course, in his book, Eikenberry's book is discussed. Discussed as well. But this is not a critique of Eikenberry either. In fact, it may be complementary to Eikenberry in some ways, because what liberal Leviathan does is basically talks about the past and a little bit about the present, but it doesn't talk a lot about the future. So how the liberal order came about under American hegemony and what crisis it is facing, especially under George W. Bush, that's basically covered very well in his book. But what might come when he talks about reconstitution of the liberal order, what it might actually look like, you don't get a very good sense from this. And I think in my book, I don't provide all the answers. That'll be probably for the next book. But at least I go further by talking about this multiplex world to replace unipolar moment, or even a possible return to the multipolar world of pre-Second World War period. Now, let me start with a few critiques of the idea of American-led liberal hegemonic order, which I have a chapter in the book called "The Myths of Liberal Hegemony," and let me just very quickly talk about four things here. The liberal hegemonic order, especially if you bring American-led into the picture, has been fairly recent, probably not until the end of the Cold War. It certainly is one of the international orders we had, but it's not the global order. It should not be conflated with global order. It's one of the international orders we had during the Cold War. It's fairly recent. It became more global after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed and China and India started their economic reforms. But it's not been really with us since end of the Second World War. And it's fairly limited in scope for much of its history. For example, during the Cold War, the Soviet bloc was not part of it, China was not part of it, India was not part of it. I was born outside the liberal hegemonic order in India, and much of the Third World was not part of it. In fact, there are some very serious contradictions. India, being the democratic state, the largest democracy in the world, was really not following, not part of that order. It had a socialist economy, non-aligned foreign policy. So only maybe democracy was something it shared with the American-led liberal order. Secondly, it denied the agency of other countries, other states, other actors in building even that liberal order. And recently, there's been a lot of new work coming out, most recently in the a special issue of global governance, to which Eric Leiner, Marty Finemore, F. Catherine Sekink, and myself have contributed, looking at how non-American actors, even non-Western actors, contributed to the creation of global institutions, global norms, including human rights. Chris Roy-Smith has a new book which says human rights was not a Western construct, how the post-colonial countries actually contributed to human rights in a very significant way. Ideas of disarmament, Eric Leiner traces the norm of international development to countries like nationalist Republican China and Latin American countries. Catherine Sekink makes the same point about Latin American countries and their agency and human rights. But you also bring in the European Union, which has been a major actor in building some of the norms of this liberal order. And Miles Kaler, in a chapter he's writing for a book I'm editing, argues. Third, not much on the dark side of the liberal order. This is important for credibility. We don't want to criticize the United States has foreign policy for its own sake, but actually acknowledging the limitations and the dark side of that order actually helps to establish this credibility and makes it less ideological. And finally, it's too focused on global institutions. I said formal global institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN Security Council. Now, and there are formal institutions and they're also global in scope. It doesn't really accord much agency, much recognition to regional institutions or informal networks, civil society, transnational movements. And this is particularly in relation to this idea of American liberal hegemonic order. But the United States always had a very ambiguous relationship with the global civil society, transnational social movements, and regional institutions. Regional institutions, it supported regionalism in Europe. It actually at one point actively opposed regionalism in Asia and was indifferent to regionalism in other parts of the world. Now moving on, what about the emerging world order? I invoke the metaphor of a multiplex world order. And I argue that the emerging world is not going to be multipolar or bipolar, as people say, US, China, G2, but a multiplex. And multiplex to me has three elements. I'll go through them very quickly. Multiple actors, and those actors are not just powers, but old powers, emerging powers, non-state actors, international organizations, multinationals, good forces like Human Rights Watch, villains like ISIS, non-state actors. These all constitute this. Now, I must say that this part of elaboration of multiplex wasn't there that much in the book. I have been thinking about it since the book was published. In a lot of the debates and discussions I've been having around the world on this book, people ask me, in fact, a recent review of the book by Joe Nye poses this very frontally. He says this book is good and it's criticisms of the liberal order, but not very clear about what sort of alternative is emerging. And maybe that's part of a second book, but again, I try to elaborate a little bit more in some of my op-eds and in my discussions and presentations. So the first element is multiple actors. Second is complex global interdependence. Now, of course, interdependence is nothing new, and you know about complex interdependence from Cohen and Nye. But I think it's also important to say that the interdependence today is global. It's very different from 19th century European economic interdependence, which some critics think didn't work and could have even have aggravated the rivalry in Europe, leading to the First and the Second World Wars. I think today's interdependence is qualitatively different. It's much broader, based on not only trade, but finance and production networks, transnational production networks. And it is global. We're talking about phenomena like BRICS or G20, where we have countries from southern tip of Latin America, southern tip of Africa, southern India, and Europe, Japan, Northeast Asia, Australia, and they're all politically but also economically and financially linked together in a way the world has never seen before. So it's not a regional interdependence, it's not an interdependence of the like-minded countries, it's much more global and that has implications. Then I talk about also third element of multiplex is multiple layers of governance. And here you can talk about global, inter-regional, like relationships between, say, the European Union and Asia, European Union and Africa. But you also talk about regional, which, both in Europe, but in most parts of the world, there are regional institutions, some more successful than others. I have done a lot of work on ASEAN myself, which I think is more successful than its critics are willing to admit. And I think that's part of the multiplex. It's a complex of multiple actors, complex interdependence, and multiple layers of governance. Of course, the term multiplex I borrowed from cinema, where you talk about a multiplex theater, where you have the choice of not only seeing one movie, but several films. You can see a Western film, especially if you go to Asia, not all the movies running in a multiplex are from Hollywood. They would have a Hollywood film, they may have a Bollywood film, if it is in South Asia or Southeast Asia. They would have a Kung Fu Chinese or Hong Kong and Taiwan film. Korean films or soap operas are very popular now. So you have a choice of movies diversity of plots, directors, actors. There may be some movies which will be dominant, but I think it's a mistake to think that Hollywood films are always most popular. That's not true in Southeast Asia or in India. So it gives you more diversity. And multiplex is different from a single screen theater where you see one film at a time until that fades. You wait and you see another one. So like British hegemony, and that faded or ended, and American hegemony took over. Now a multiplex gives you several stories running at the same time, and there is no single hegemony for any appreciable length of time. And that also adds to the metaphor of multiplex. Now, in the rest of the book, I talk about emerging powers. I think emerging powers is, one more point before I finish with multiplex. I did say that the decline debate, in the outset I said decline debate is a bit of a distraction because the evidence that I examined is very much mixed. You can read it either way, depending on which evidence and what time frame you're using. So I think it's indeterminate, to use social science language. But what is more important is that there are other challenges to U.S. role, the liberal hegemonic order. And they're not necessarily coming from the rise of the rest, as Acharya said, that U.S. is not declining, but others are rising. No, that's not the only change that's happening. I mean, the thing is the world is getting more complex with transnational challenges and like terrorism and diffusion of new ideas, like ideas that challenge the sanctity of state sovereignty. So instead of rise and fall of powers and looking at world order in terms of rise and fall of great powers, we should look at the possible potential for change in world order in terms of diffusion of power and ideas at the same time, and take into account challenges other than shifting distribution of power, who is rising and who is falling. And those challenges have little to do with American decline per se. Even if the United States gets back to 5% economic growth or 4% economic growth, doesn't mean China is going to go back to zero growth or India is going to go back to negative growth, the way they were in the well, at least China was in the 60s, and India had this Hindu rate of growth of 3%, 4%. So whether you accept the statistics of Goldman Sachs about the BRICS, or you are skeptical, it's good to be skeptical, but it's important to bear in mind that there are a lot of changes that are happening which have nothing to do with US decline. And those changes are important to keep in mind when you think of the future of the world order. Now, coming to emerging powers, I think there's a bit of hype about this. I don't think emerging powers can govern the world, provide a credible alternative, but they can be spoilers. Their power to resist has certainly grown. And some of that we have been watching and seeing unfolding before us, not accepting the UN General Assembly resolution against Russia, for example. Well, I mean, abstaining, but abstaining is a form of resistance for me. But also the idea of creating the BRICS Bank, or for China far more consequential than BRICS Bank is going to be the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is really very attractive to a lot of Asian countries. So this is not challenging the liberal order frontally, but it may be introducing a complexity by stealth. It's about forcing the Western countries and the existing international institutions to think of reform seriously or risk irrelevance. So we see that changes are happening, and we should not always think of change as being driven by major catastrophe, major war. I mean, it's been a mindset to say that new world orders only come about after a major war or major catastrophe. Now, the change can also happen by stealth or in a slow motion way, and now we see that happening, and that's a characteristic of the multiplex world. Also talk about regional orders. I think I give more importance to regional orders than a lot of liberals do. It's very strange because European Union is very much in the liberal mold. But if you look at the writings of U.S. grand strategy, regionalism is seen as kind of as a add-on supplement or even destructive force. I mean, in John's book, Eikenberry's book, there are many references to regionalism, which equates it with fragmentation, 19th century, return to 19th century balance of power politics. Now, this is not based on what's happening actually in the world in terms of regionalism. Regionalism today is very different from 19th century regionalism or pre-World War regionalism. It's much more open today. There's a lot of inter-regionalism going on. It's much more diverse in its scope. It's not geared to security or even trade only. I mean, regional organizations do all kinds of things, promote human rights, democracy, play a role in environment, managing the environment, and also open. Regionalism is open. I mean, Asian regionalism is a very good example of how regionalism and globalism coexist. For example, ASEAN is a regional institution, but its membership, it has expanded membership through like ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Dialogue Partnership, includes all the major powers of the international system, including the US, and they hold regular meetings in Asia. Including the European Union, by the way, which is a member of our ASEAN Regional Forum. So this is not the exclusionary trading bloc kind of regionalism. That might happen, but I don't see a lot of chances of that happening. Regionalism is going to be complementary, but it can also do a lot more with a bit of recognition and help. And I really am struck by how much resistance to the idea of regionalism there is, especially in the United States. So conclusion, I have some policy implications. I know I'm in a think tank, not in an academia where we may avoid giving policy advice or implications. Now, one issue is about question of instability. How do you look at instability in the world today, or in the multiplex world? Is the multiplex world going to be stable or unstable? Now, today, the temptation is to answer that question in the negative. So much bad things happening in the world. But some instability in a multiplex system or world order, it cannot be avoided. There's not going to be perfect peace. But it's not also a given that it's going to be a catastrophic or a breakdown. I mean, you can make an argument that some of the problems we are facing today have directly to do with failed interventions, like in Iraq, for example, or like some might even add Libya to it, or policies which were avoidable, not necessarily a given. I mean, so some of them are going to happen because the world is never going to be a perfect place. But that doesn't mean that the world is going to fall apart, as people are beginning to, some people are beginning to argue. My other related advice is that when we look at the future of world order, let's not just go back to European history and say, oh, multipolarity was stable at this period and therefore, or unstable at this period, therefore it will be unstable future. Bipolarity was stable in that period and it will be stable in the future, or unipolarity. So a lot of the history we draw from in order to explain the future or anticipate the future is derived from Europe. Look at Henry Kissinger's new book, World Order. I actually was at the book lunch a couple of weeks ago in CSIS, and I asked him a question or two. I think one question he answered that on China. But it's a very Eurocentric book. I mean, it basically says the only way to build real world order, Westphalia first, and then he goes back to his PhD dissertation, A World Restored, Metternich and Kesselrigg, and the concept of Europe. Well, I mean, the world is very different. The world is not Europe anymore. We have never lived in this world, that the world we are going to live in. There is a global constellation of powers that are widely dispersed in different parts of the world. This is a brave new world, and we don't know how far we have to be a little humble. And we also have to be aware of other types of world orders that have been built through history, and maybe think more creatively. So you look at the debate between Chris Lane and Bill Oldforth, whether unipolarity is an illusion or unipolarity is going to last forever, or Kenneth Ward. A lot of the evidence comes from the European international history. But again, it's very short-sighted. We're not living in European history anymore, or European interstate system anymore. True, it has diffused, it has become global in many ways, expanded, but there are so many new elements and variations that we should really think about world order in different terms, in global terms. Next, the United States do not try too hard to restore its hegemony, liberal hegemonic order, because trying too hard could cause instability. I find that a lot of American writers, when they talk about American decline, even when they accept American decline, somehow go back in the last chapter saying these are the 5 things the US should do to reestablish itself as the preeminent power. And this is true of almost like even critiques of the United States foreign policy. I think it's not only not possible, but also undesirable, because the United States cannot simply go back to the period of the immediate post-Second World War period. And related to that, also trying too hard to reestablish sort of hegemony will backfire, because it will invite resistance from countries like China and even countries like India and Brazil. So instead, the United States look for shared leadership. When Obama spoke at West Point, he had this punchline that America must always lead. And in fact, Henry Kissinger, and this is one point I agree with him, he said that's a very bad idea. The United States should not always lead. It's to lead in areas where it can and help others to lead in other areas. And that was actually in my book and also in some of the op-eds I wrote. And those others can include European countries, but also some, you should self-consciously try to also engage the emerging powers. The tone there has changed a bit from early Obama administration to the post-Ukraine Obama administration's policy. But it's not just about engaging Russia. There are other regional emerging powers, regional powers, and also need to reform global institutions meaningfully, not half-heartedly. Need to really provide more support to regional institutions that practice open regionalism, and there's a variety of ways the U.S. can share leadership rather than pining for a restoration of the primacy that it used to enjoy. And transatlantic relations should be aimed for that as well. I think I was in France and Germany recently, but had a very interesting discussion in France. And I think one of the things I said is that it's great to have NATO as a force for stability, but if you equate NATO with Western values all the time, then it alienates people. I mean, I am alienated when I say NATO is beholden to Western values, even though I would agree on the importance of democracy and human rights. But this idea of West versus the rest, and which has even come up after the Ukraine crisis, even newspapers like Financial Times, which I trust, talking about Russia took Western territory. Well, the Western values is being undermined. I think that alienates a lot of people in the world, even though in practice NATO is a group of like-minded states, and it's fair enough, and it performs a very important role. But making it less ideological and more pragmatic in orientation could actually help. And that's it. We should not pine for the past, restoring American hegemony, but boldly go where no one has gone before. Star Trek.